And when you zoom out and really strip away the romantic veneer, the term yellow fever isn't actually about attraction at all.
No.
It's not a superficial preference. It's a systemic condition, a highly specific architectural design rooted in over a century of colonial policy and media construction that was built to define and constrain one specific group of women.
It is fundamentally an architecture of power.
Yeah.
We are not talking about someone who just happens to find a certain physical aesthetic appealing.
Right.
We are talking about deep structural dynamics rooted in colonization, warfare, and, economic exploitation that produced this so-called preference as a side effect.
So our mission today is really a forensic examination of this architecture, how a persistent sexual fantasy became a blueprint, not just for cultural, but for commercial and economic damage.
And the catastrophic impact it has had on the mental health of Asian women globally, it's huge.
It is. And when you look at the evidence, the core conflict is, well, it's undeniable. On one side, you have this massive external narrative that has positioned Asian women as a sort of global commodity.
Either the hypersexualized exotic temptress or the perfectly compliant wife. It's this structural noise built to serve external needs.
And pitted directly against that structural noise is the internal psychological reality felt by the individuals targeted by this gaze.
A constant state of self-doubt, fragmentation, and perhaps most tragically, depersonalization.
Exactly. The story isn't the fetish itself. The story is that gap, the chasm between the structural fantasy and the personal trauma. So let's unpack this. To understand the modern, the commercialized expression of this dynamic, you have to look at the colonial roots.
Absolutely.
This didn't start with Hollywood blockbusters. It started with policy and power structures defining who was desirable and why. Where did the initial blueprints for this fantasy begin?
Well, the colonial period functioned as a kind of psychological factory. It manufactured and exported stereotypes that served the interests of imperial power.
And two primary archetypes were created.
Two, and they are still running today, often existing simultaneously. The subservient lotus blossom and the calculating, dangerous dragon lady.
But what's critical is that both serve the same structural purpose.
Control. It was always about control.
And what's fascinating from an architectural perspective is the sheer structural benefit this created for colonial powers. When you look at the analysis of colonial records, we're talking about places like Dutch Indonesia, it shows that colonizers were actively defining beauty standards.
They weren't just observing. They were creating a hierarchy. It's right there in the records. There are places where they sometimes ranked Southeast Asian women as physically more attractive than white women.
But, and this is the key, this was not benign appreciation.
Not even close. This was strategic positioning.
How so? What was the political incentive to position these women as desirable while simultaneously maintaining, racial supremacy?
The logic is actually pretty clear when you break it down. Asian women were pitched as fitting the white male fantasy better because of a perceived lack of drive for equality.
So the fantasy wasn't even primarily physical.
No, it was ideological and social. If you are a white colonizer, you want the perfectly feminine woman, someone who fulfills all those traditional gender ideals, but crucially, one who will not challenge your political or racial superiority.
So the toxic foundation of yellow fever is entitlement masquerading as desire.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It's the belief of the white man that he is superior, and therefore he is entitled to the bodies and the compliance of Asian women. The system wasn't saying, you are beautiful.
No, it was saying, you are beautiful because you are compliant, because you will meet my needs and my enjoyment without demanding too much back.
Unlike the women in my own culture who are now demanding rights.
Precisely. It's an arrangement based on an inherent racialized hierarchy. The desirability is conditional upon the woman accepting a submissive role that reinforces the man's power.
And if she stepped outside that role?
Then she immediately shifted into the dragon lady archetype, the dangerous, calculating threat that must be neutralized. It's a no-win scenario for individuality. It's a trap.
And once that colonial root was firmly planted, Western media became the grand amplifier.
Oh, yeah.
The mechanism for codifying this structural prejudice into a universal emotional narrative. They transformed a political construct into a consumer product.
And Hollywood was the primary factory floor for that.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the early cinematic landscape that cemented these tropes for generations of viewers who might never have even met an Asian woman in real life.
These films literally taught the audience what to expect.
Right.
We looked at the specific film analysis, and the data is It's devastatingly consistent. We are talking about classics like Sayonara, The Tea House of the August Moon, and of course, the foundational text for this fantasy, The World of Susie Wong.
And the statistics, they just revealed the blueprint. 80% of the films analyzed showed Asian women exclusively paired with white men.
80%.
This established a critical visual message. Asian women exist in orbit around white masculinity. That's the only place you see them.
And that pairing almost always occurred in a transactional setting. A staggering 90% of the time, the Asian female character was portrayed as a sex worker or someone defined by their sexual availability.
So it moved the objectification from a structural policy into a visual canon.
It made it appear normal, inevitable, and even romantic.
And the cinematic techniques themselves reinforce this idea of the woman as property, as a thing. The Asian female character was consistently presented as a gift.
A gift.
And we are talking about 100% of cases involving hypersexualization through explicit sexual stunners and close-up body shots. These are techniques designed solely to reduce the character to a desirable body part for the male gaze.
Both for the men in the film and the audience watching at home.
Exactly.
And the character dynamics were never equal. The analysis showed that in 100% of the cases, there was a dramatic imbalance of social status.
The male character was always dominating, retaining the power to define and dissolve the relationship whenever he wanted.
While the female character, meanwhile, was praised specifically for a very narrow, predetermined set of personalities.
Docile, innocent, and inherently submissive.
This imbalance culminates in that ubiquitous white knight trope.
Oh, the white savior.
Yeah. Take Robert Lomax saving Susie Wong from prostitution. The entire narrative imbalance isn't accidental. It's the structural core of the fantasy.
The white male literally saves the Asian female, cementing this idea that she is fundamentally flawed, endangered, or incomplete, and requires Western masculine intervention to achieve safety or legitimacy or moral purity.
It's control disguised as rescue. It is the perfect ideological justification for entitlement. I am not taking advantage of you, I am elevating you.
And this trope, once it was established on screen, provided the cultural scaffolding for the real-world policies that followed.
It created the demand.
Yes. It established the character dynamics so clearly that when the opportunity arose in real life, society was already primed to accept this imbalanced pairing as the only valid narrative.
The cinema sold the emotional dream, but policy and military action built the physical infrastructure for it to be lived out in reality.
This is where it gets really grim.
This is where the architecture of power transitions from propaganda to palpable social engineering.
And we had to trace the line back to military camp towns. Following the surrender of Imperial Japan, the comfort stations, those brutal systems of sexual slavery originally established around military bases were simply repurposed.
They didn't go away.
No, they became government-sponsored Kishichan prostitution centers for U.S. soldiers during and after the Korean War.
And the state was actively involved in managing this industry.
Actively. These women were not seen as individuals. They were explicitly designated as a resource for the morale and relaxation of foreign soldiers.
They were, in the brutal words used in the research, treated as playthings.
That establishes a state-sanctioned framework of objectification that outlives the war itself. It becomes normalized.
And that system created a persistent cycle of poverty and necessity that fed right back into the commodification loop.
Especially in the Philippines. The heavy U.S. military presence there cultivated massive prostitution districts. The economic fallout of catering to this foreign demand was so extensive that by the early 2000s, the Philippines tragically topped all other Southeast Asian countries with 600,000 women involved in prostitution.
600,000 women. That statistic is just. It's a chilling demonstration of structural legacy. It shows that colonization laid the groundwork and the economic fallout kept the system perpetually operational.
It normalized the idea that these female bodies were a resource for foreign consumption.
And then the laws backed it up. This is where the system achieved its highest level of normalization within the United States demographic landscape.
You're talking about the War Brides Act.
The War Brides Act of 1945. It was passed to provide a legal and, a relatively clean avenue for Asian women who married white American servicemen to immigrate to the U.S.
That is a staggering piece of social engineering. It institutionalized the fantasy.
It provided a clear federal pathway for these WMAF pairings and normalized that specific demographic dynamic within American society. It essentially stamped the white knight narrative with a visa.
Exactly. And the inverse is the critical silence here. While this door was opening for Asian women married to white men, Asian men were simultaneously locked out.
Locked out of that same legal pathway for entry and legitimacy, often still subject to racist anti-miscegenation laws, or simply unable to secure the same immigration advantages.
So the government was sending a powerful structural
We
message.
have a very clear one.
Good.
Certain Asian bodies, paired with white male power, are desired, valued, and granted citizenship, based entirely on their utility in fitting the exotic, compliant fantasy.
It legalized the exotic fantasy and gave it a permanent, normalized foothold in American society that persists today.
It set up the demographic pattern we still see playing out. It wasn't just about immigration, it was about defining desirability and granting status based on racialized sexual utility. That is the foundational architecture of the contemporary issue.
So if that first part was about the blueprints and the construction of this system, this next part is about the political maintenance of the structure and the devastating costs it exacts on the individual.
And the persistence of this dynamic is maintained in part by the ingenious creation of the sexual model minority stereotype.
This is a remarkable piece of ideological architecture because it is a synthesis. It takes the mainstream model minority myth, the idea that Asian Americans are naturally successful, disciplined, and value education.
And it welds it directly onto the pre-existing sexual stereotypes of docility and exoticism.
Exactly.
And what's the political function of this ideal? Why does this composite stereotype need to exist?
Well, it functions as a political weapon, as a foil.
Yeah.
This representation of the Asian woman as ideal, this union of sex appeal with family-centered values and a strong work ethic, is strategically deployed.
How?
The literature is unambiguous about this. This stereotype acts as a perfect contrast against stereotypes of lazy and politically demanding blacks and against white women endorsing feminist values of independence and autonomy.
That's a profoundly cynical strategy.
It is.
The stereotype provides a perfect, non-threatening figure against which to criticize two other politically active groups. It's anti-feminist backlash codified and weaponized.
And men who feel threatened by changing gender dynamics, by the rise of feminism and the loss of traditional power structures, they look for a woman who supposedly embodies a return to traditional, comfortable gender roles.
And they project that ideal onto the demure, obedient Asian woman.
But there's a massive contradiction built into that ideal,
A
right?
huge one. To fit the model minority myth, she has to be ambitious, educated, and successful. But to fit the sexual fantasy, she has to be docile, submissive, and prioritize the male ego above her own demands. How do the men who subscribe to this even manage that contradiction?
They lie to themselves. What's truly revealing in the interviews is that when asked, men who prefer Asian women often begin by vehemently denying the idea that Asian women are submissive.
They'll say, oh no, they're strong and independent.
Exactly. But when they keep talking, they invariably mention, in one way or another, that Asian women are submissive or easier or less complicated.
So the fantasy has to be denied publicly to avoid sounding racist or sexist, but it must be maintained privately for the fantasy to function.
The required mental gymnastics are exhausting, and they place an impossible burden on the women themselves, who are expected to fulfill both contradictory roles simultaneously.
And this architecture of commodification and contradiction translates directly into severe psychological damage. This isn't abstract.
No, we have empirical data detailing the emotional toll. A thematic analysis of Asian women in Europe exposed 5 key, devastating themes related to this yellow fever exposure.
Let's ground this in the human cost. The first theme, and maybe the most foundational, is diminished self-esteem.
These women felt that their Asian phenotype, the very thing that the fetishizers supposedly desired, led both society and themselves to view them as less desirable people.
Undermining their sense of personal worth outside of that exotic context.
And that spirals into the second and third themes, seeking validation and internalizing stereotypes.
Which is the cruel psychological trick.
It is. The women themselves internalize the belief that they are only desirable to certain men, often men they themselves deem less desirable or less successful, which circles back and reinforces the belief that they are inherently less desirable overall.
It's a self-hatred loop powered by external objectification.
And this feeds directly into the fourth theme, the daily exhaustion of pressure to conform to stereotypes. They are constantly managing the external expectation of being the lotus blossom, or, conversely, avoiding the perception that they are the dragon lady.
It's constant psychological labor.
Yes, and the consequence is the fifth theme. Perceived lack of agency defeat, this feeling that they are utterly powerless against these pervasive narratives.
But the deepest wound, I think, is that fifth theme, the intuitive recognition of ethical dissonance.
They feel shock, discomfort, anger, and sadness because they know the attention they receive isn't genuine. They recognize they're being viewed as representatives of an ethnic type, an ideal, or a category, not as complex individuals.
That recognition leads to the core psychological trauma, depersonalization.
Exactly. When you are seen as interchangeable, as easily substitutable with any other Asian woman because the person only sees the racial marker, you lose your selfhood. You are homogenized. You become a role, not a person.
And the research highlights a terrifying implication of this objectification.
It's very scary. If the system has successfully erased the woman's humanity by reducing her to a commodity, then that objectification can lead directly to physical violence.
When she is viewed as an object rather than a person, the restraints on violence are significantly weakened. This is the real danger of erasing agency.
And the constant doubt, that psychological burden of constantly questioning a partner's interests is just relentless.
I can't get that quote out of my head. Every time someone messages me, I wonder if it's because I'm Asian.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
You are stripped of the ability to simply experience genuine attraction without the exhausting interrogation of racial motive.
It's an emotional tax on every single intimate interaction. It poisons the well of dating and relationships because the woman is perpetually forced to perform a forensic analysis on the motives of the person across from her.
Is this love or is this architecture?
She never gets to just be.
And we need to acknowledge that this system of commodification extends far beyond physical desirability.
Right, it touches her economic value, her labor, her entire identity.
Especially in structured markets like the mail-order bride industry. This is where we see the concept of double commodification.
This is a crucial distinction. In these markets, the woman, often a Filipina, is first commodified as the idealized image of the perfect wife.
That's the initial sale, the exotic, compliant partner.
But the second commodification is far more insidious.
Much more. Once purchased, her labor is all that being a wife entails, stripped down and intensified. The subordinate domestic service, emotional support, child rearing, sexual availability, all of it is expected to be delivered without complaint.
It's the total, individualized, self-erasing nature of that labor that is monetized.
And this leads to profound dissociation. We see findings among Filipinas who return from sex work, and they describe a sense of defining themselves only in physical terms.
They feel entirely dissociated from their labor and their identity.
It reflects the self-erasing nature of their expected role. They have become the commodity entirely, losing touch with the person underneath.
What's insidious is how the media system protects its structural architecture by creating a kind of smokescreen.
They blame individuals instead of the system.
Yes. We see this in entertainment commodities like reality TV that showcases these clearly transactional or commodified relationships.
When audiences express disgust over the power dynamics, the disgust is almost always displaced onto the bad actor.
Everyone rallies to denounce a specific character, say Ed from the popular example, as a disgusting, cringeworthy person.
And the structural issues of colonization, economic desperation, and gender hierarchy are completely obscured by the individualized villain.
The audience focuses on how gross Ed is instead of recognizing that the entire market, the entire show, and the entire premise are built upon the systemic exploitation enabled by those colonial histories we just discussed.
This individualization effect serves as a perfect defense mechanism for the architecture of the fetish. It allows the general public to feel morally superior by hating the individual perpetrator, which deflects all attention away from the systemic, profit-driven mechanisms that enable and promote the fetish in the first place.
This brings us right up to the contemporary moment where the structural narrative built over a century is starting to show signs of internal fracture.
Especially among younger generations.
Yes, there is a deep, fascinating tension appearing in dating culture.
This is where we get the data that just scrambles the conventional wisdom.
It really does. Look at the 2024 study involving Asian American women, mostly Gen Z, mean age around 22. Their stated preferences were a shock.
For decades, the established narrative was that Asian women overwhelmingly preferred white men and often expressed open dislike or repulsion for Asian men.
The infamous idea that Asian men remind them of their brother.
Right. But the new study showed a massive reversal. Asian men scored highest in both desired dating and attraction, with white men scoring last across the board.
Last. So this suggests either a profound, genuine decolonization of desire has occurred in a single generation, or something else is at play.
And the response from the online community was immediate and deeply skeptical.
Immediately. The counter-narrative is that these Gen Z participants aren't expressing genuine desire. They are performing. They are being mindful and are exaggerating or outright lying about liking men of color and disliking white men.
And the motive for this performance is fear.
Fear of what?
Fear of being seen as white-worshipping, fear of being labeled a Lou, or fear of being deemed self-hating. They want, desperately, to be seen as people of color who are politically aware and morally aligned.
So this is the tension. Is the shift in stated preferences a genuine decolonization of the mind and heart? Or is it a strategic performance designed to elevate social status, avoid public shame, and position oneself correctly within the current digital social hierarchy?
The difference between the two is profound.
It's everything. If the performance is successful, it means the architecture of fetishization has simply been replaced by a new architecture of social pressure.
Instead of pressure to conform to the white gaze, there's pressure to conform to the decolonized gaze. It just replaces one form of homogenization with another.
And that pressure is particularly intense in the digital space, where being called a Lu, a specific term for an Asian woman perceived as prioritizing white male approval above her own people, can be socially devastating.
This isn't just about dating choices. It's about identity policing on a mass scale.
So we have to ask, when does genuine desire, which is messy and complex, stop? And when does the psychological pressure to perform the right identity begin?
The Gen Z data, whatever its truth, is highly politicized and deeply policed by collective shame.
And the persistence of deeply entrenched, internalized racial ideals suggests that even if some desires are shifting, the cultural architecture still strongly favors whiteness.
Oh, absolutely. We see the direct mechanisms of this internalization expressed in beauty standards globally.
Look at the evolution of ideals in East Asia. In South Korea, the traditional female beauty ideal was historically associated with fertility and motherhood, a wide moon-like face.
And now, with the globalization of Western media and increased wealth, women are actively seeking extensive cosmetic surgery to achieve the complete opposite.
They are seeking a narrower face, a V-line jaw, wider eyes, and a higher nose bridge.
It's a conscious aesthetic distancing from the maternal body and a palpable adoption of Caucasian aesthetics. The surgical procedures themselves are designed to create features that read as Eurocentric.
And this isn't exclusively a modern phenomenon. In Vietnam and China, the preference for pale skin has historically been, and remains, a potent signifier of high social status.
Which leads to heavy use of skin lightening products. This is a complex mix of local class dynamics and globalized racial ideals, contrasting even with the Western ideal of tan skin, but both rooted in a hierarchy of status.
And the dating study we mentioned earlier crystallized the psychological link here.
It really did.
It found a noticeable positive correlation between internalized racism, meaning self-hatred or rejection of one's own background, and a preference for dating white men.
And conversely, it showed a negative correlation, an active repulsion against dating Asian men.
This demonstrates that the media architecture that codified Asian femininity around white men was so effective that the internalized desire became a structural, measurable, psychological fact.
Breaking down that architecture requires an immense conscious effort that goes beyond simple preference. It's deep work.
While the architecture we've discussed today has overwhelmingly targeted Asian women, the landscape of desire is actively changing.
Right, primarily due to the global influence of Asian media, particularly in the male sphere.
The explosion of the Korean wave, Hallyu, and K-pop has created a completely new phenomenon, the obsessive fetishization of Korean men.
This is now a mass market product. You see anecdotal evidence of this globally, comments like, "I want to date a Korean guy so badly." It's everywhere.
And this Hallyu phenomenon creates a powerful global Netflix effect, where highly curated romantic Korean dramas influence dating expectations and even feed into international romance tourism.
It's curated, hypersexualized, almost idealized male archetype that exists in sharp contrast to decades of Western media representation.
Decades of it. Historically, Western stereotypes of Asian men were primarily effeminate, nerdy, or conversely, overly controlling and patriarchal, rarely romantic leads.
And the systemic lack of representation for Asian men in key Western media channels, like mainstream porn and reality shows, meant they often lacked the prime stud examples that white and black men had established for themselves.
So the K-pop wave offers a specific, curated, and highly commercialized archetype that attempts to fill that void. But it, too, runs the risk of veering quickly into fetish territory.
Of course. It's an ideal that is often detached from the reality of a man himself, substituting one form of racialized homogenization for another, just dressed up with better fashion and choreography.
The complexity is that for Asian men, this fetishization comes not from historical, military, or colonial entitlement, but from a purely aesthetic cultural export that bypasses the traditional Western gatekeepers of desirability.
It's an interesting inversion of the power dynamic, but still reduces individuals to an interchangeable category, the K-pop idol type. It's still a box.
And it's important to note that the very concept of racialized and hierarchical sexual attraction exists within a broader social context where complex power dynamics are commercially normalized.
Through kink and fetish culture.
Exactly. We see the outright commodification of kink across the board. Race play, age play, and submission dynamics are not only commercially available through erotic literature, media, accessories,
But they are openly discussed, sometimes even in therapeutic contexts. These are often treated as deeply emotional and mental experiences, distinct from vanilla sex, and highly preferred by practitioners.
and this normalization means that the line between a consensual kink dynamic, where power exchange is negotiated and temporary, and an actualized systemic racial fetish becomes incredibly blurred.
Where does individual exploration end, and where does structural objectification, built on centuries of oppression, begin?
The difference is consent and the ability to exit the dynamic without social harm.
And the digital realm, which is the modern architecture of desire, is now the central battleground for this distinction.
We've seen platforms like Reddit actively enforcing actions against communities dedicated to sexualizing others without their consent.
For example, the banning of communities focused on the non-consensual sexualization of K-pop idols.
And this enforcement highlights that the structural control over fetish content is being contested. These platforms are forced to draw boundaries, recognizing that non-consensual sexualization, even when directed at public figures, is a form of harassment and objectification.
It forces the uncomfortable truth into the open. Fantasy, when it translates into homogenization and non-consensual use of identity, ceases to be benign and becomes structural violence.
The difference between a healthy kink exploration and a destructive fetish is whether the person is essential and unique.
Or whether they are simply interchangeable with the next body that carries the same racial signifiers.
So if we pull back and synthesize the entire story we've tracked, the Asian fetish is not a frivolous, superficial attraction.
Not at all.
It is a complex, enduring structure rooted in colonial and economic power dynamics, actively reinforced by media and policy, and carefully maintained through systemic political function.
And its human cost, as we've seen, is immense, inflicting deep psychological trauma through depersonalization and the forced self-doubt of constantly questioning, am I seen as a person or just a racialized, compliant object?
The system is designed to erase the individual in favor of the commodity.
Which brings us back to the most contemporary tension, that Gen Z dating data and the performance of identity.
In an era where performing decolonized authenticity is socially and politically valued, how do you distinguish between genuinely shifting desire and the psychological pressure to perform the right identity?
If the most profound trauma discussed by the women we studied is feeling homogenized and interchangeable, how does one authentically claim individuality when identity itself is monetized, constantly under political review, and policed by the judgment of their own peers?
That search for genuine selfhood in a world that only sees a category.
That is the definitive struggle of the modern condition.
Indeed. This episode is powered by Neon Core Media for stories they said were too real to tell.